Morning sunlight spilled across the eastern pasture of Wildflower Ranch as I stepped onto my porch, coffee mug in hand. Steam rose from the dark liquid, mingling with the crisp autumn air. The ranch had been in my family for 4 generations, a sprawling 200 acres of rolling grassland, oak groves, and clear running streams. My great-grandfather had purchased this land in 1932, during the depths of the Great Depression, when nobody wanted rural property 30 miles from the nearest town. The property stretched out before me, golden in the early light. Cattle grazed lazily in the distance, moving between water sources with the practiced routine of animals that knew this land as well as I did. The eastern fence line marked the boundary where my property had always ended, but beyond it now stood the skeletons of new construction, the Meadowbrook Estates subdivision that had been slowly growing over the past 3 years. I finished my coffee and set to work on the day's chores. Monday meant checking the perimeter fencing and moving the cattle to fresh pasture. The north field needed attention before winter, and the barn roof had begun to leak during the last heavy rain. Ranch life never paused for rest, but the work connected me to this place in ways I could never properly explain to outsiders. Every fence post I had driven, every structure I had built with my own hands made this land an extension of myself. By mid-afternoon, I noticed an unfamiliar truck parked near my eastern property line. Two people stood beside it, looking out over my grazing land and gesturing toward the creek that cut through both properties. Friendly as always, I walked over to introduce myself. The couple explained they had just moved into one of the newly completed homes in Meadowbrook Estates. "Your ranch is beautiful," the woman said, admiring the view. "We love having this natural space so close to our new home." "Thank you. My family has worked hard to preserve it," I replied, offering to show them around sometime if they were interested in ranch life. The conversations remained pleasant over the following weeks as more families moved into the development. Occasionally, new residents would stop by with questions or comments. Most seemed genuinely appreciative of the rustic charm my working ranch added to their views. Nevertheless, subtle concerns began to emerge. Comments about cattle noise carrying on the morning air, questions about whether my fertilizer might affect their landscaping, remarks about the ranch access road generating dust that drifted toward their properties. Then came the invitation to attend a Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association meeting to discuss matters of mutual interest between the community and adjacent properties. The phrasing seemed innocuous enough, so I agreed to attend, hoping to establish good relations with my new neighbors. The meeting took place in their newly constructed community center, all gleaming surfaces and modern furniture. Victoria Harrington, the HOA president, greeted me with practiced charm. Her handshake was firm, her smile wide but somehow never warming her calculating eyes. "We are so pleased you could join us, Mr. Miller," she said, gesturing toward a seat at the front of the room. "We have some community enhancement initiatives to discuss that may impact shared boundaries." Throughout the meeting, I noticed how she referred to my ranch as the adjacent agricultural zone, rather than by name or as my property. When I raised concerns about increased traffic along our shared access road, Victoria dismissed them with bureaucratic phrases about community development phases and infrastructure improvements, offering no actual solutions. The following morning brought the first true warning sign. Walking my eastern fence line, I discovered a row of survey stakes driven into the ground, bright orange markers cutting 20 feet into what had always been my property. No notice, no permission, no explanation. Just the first silent shot in what would become a war for my land. The sound of heavy machinery jolted me awake at 6:30 on a Tuesday morning. The noise was close, too close to be road work on the main county highway. I threw on clothes and rushed outside to investigate. What I saw made my stomach drop. 3 large trucks had parked along my eastern property line, and workers in bright yellow vests were unloading metal fence posts, concrete mix, and chain-link fencing materials. They had already marked a line with spray paint that cut directly through my east pasture. I strode toward the nearest worker, a heavy-set man consulting blueprints spread across the hood of a truck. "Excuse me, what is going on here? This is private property." The man looked up, unsurprised by my appearance. "Morning. We are installing the security fence for Meadowbrook Estates. All permits are in order." He handed me a folder containing official-looking documents. "Security fen. See, on my property. Nobody discussed this with me," I said, flipping through papers filled with technical language and county stamps. "I never agreed to any of this." The foreman, Steve, according to his name tag, pointed to a signature line at the bottom of one document. "We do not need your permission. The HOA has obtained proper easement rights through the county. This buffer zone was designated in the original development plan." My heart pounded as I stared at the county seal on the permit. There must be some mistake. I need to speak with the HOA immediately. Steve shrugged. "We just follow the work orders, sir. You will need to take that up with Ms. Harrington and the board. We start pouring concrete footings today." I tried calling Victoria, but my calls went straight to voicemail. I left increasingly urgent messages while watching workers mark boundaries and dig post holes. By 10 o'clock, with no response, I drove directly to the Meadowbrook Estates Community Center, where the receptionist informed me that an emergency meeting could be arranged for that afternoon. When I returned at 3, Victoria sat at the head of a long table flanked by 4 other board members. The community center's fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across her face as she smiled without warmth. "Mr. Miller, we understand you have concerns about our community security enhancements," she began, folding her hands on the table. "Rest assured, everything being done is fully compliant with county regulations." I placed photographs of the construction on the table. "Those workers are 20 feet onto my property. The fence will cut off my livestock from their water access. This was never discussed with me." Victoria slid a document across the table. "Perhaps you are unaware of Ordinance 47B, which grants public utility and municipal easements along all properties adjacent to planned developments. The county approved our expansion last year." "But this is not a utility easement," I argued. "This is a security fence cutting through active grazing land." Board member Richard Thornton, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat. "The ordinance includes provisions for community safety infrastructure, which encompasses boundary security. Our residents have expressed concerns about livestock proximity to their properties." For 2 hours, I presented reasonable objections while they responded with rehearsed regulatory jargon. Every question I asked was deflected with references to obscure zoning codes and development statutes. Victoria repeatedly emphasized community safety, while implying my ranch posed potential hazards to their residents. Desperate for answers, I drove straight to the county planning office after leaving the HOA meeting. The aging government building stood in stark contrast to the sleek community center I had just left. Inside, a sympathetic county clerk named Martha pulled the relevant files but confirmed my worst fears. "This easement designation dates back to 1978, Martha explained, pointing to faded text on a county planning document. "It was created when the original farmland was first divided, long before Meadowbrook was even planned. Technically, They are within their rights to build on that 20-foot strip, though I have never seen it enforced quite like this. Martha looked genuinely troubled. I can schedule a hearing with the zoning board, but these old easements are notoriously difficult to challenge. The waiting period for a hearing is currently 6 months. The sun was setting as I drove back to my ranch. From half a mile away, I could see they had already installed dozens of fence posts. Work lights had been set up, and the crew continued building well into the evening. The concrete was already drying around the first section of posts. They were working with remarkable speed, almost as if they knew I might try to stop them and were determined to create a fait accompli. I parked my truck and walked the fence line, watching as workers secured chain link to metal posts. The barrier already extended nearly a quarter mile, with materials staged for rapid completion. Through the growing fence, the setting sun cast long, prison-like shadows across my pasture. I stood there, watching helplessly as they systematically caged in my land. 1 week later, the fence stood complete, an artificial metal boundary severing the natural flow of my ranch. 6 feet tall and topped with angled extensions, it ran for nearly 2 miles along what had once been an open eastern border of my property. The HOA had worked with military efficiency, completing in days what should have taken weeks. They had effectively cut off direct access to my lower pastures and the main water source for my livestock. The morning after completion, I stood watching my cattle gathered at the fence line, confused by the barrier blocking their path to the stream where they had watered for generations. They paced nervous, sly, occasionally pushing against the metal mesh as if testing its solidity. Their distress was palpable, a herd's routine disrupted by human boundaries they could not understand. "I know, girl," I said, patting my oldest cow as she mooed in frustration. "I do not understand it either." The logistical nightmare began immediately. What had been a simple operation now required extensive workarounds. Each morning and evening, I had to haul water in tanks loaded on my pickup to the far pasture, a 4-hour daily task that had previously not existed. The tractor path to my lower fields now required a 5-mile detour around the entire property, instead of the direct route the fence now blocked. At my kitchen table that night, surrounded by ranch ledgers and calculator, I assessed the financial impact. The additional fuel costs alone would exceed $600 monthly. Equipment that could no longer reach certain fields would need replacement with smaller, less efficient models. The stress on my livestock would likely reduce milk production and breeding success rates. Conservative estimates suggested my operating costs would increase by 40%, while productivity decreased by similar margins. Sleep became elusive as I lay awake calculating scenarios and possibilities. The ranch had always operated on thin margins, most family farms do, but these new constraints pushed the financial model beyond sustainability. Would I need to sell off part of the herd? Reduce acreage under cultivation? The questions haunted my nights. 3 separate attempts to negotiate with the HOA yielded identical results. Victoria Harrington maintained the same plastic smile while denying any flexibility. "The fence location is final and non-negotiable," she stated during our last meeting. "Our residents paid premium prices for homes with guaranteed security features. Perhaps you should consider modernizing your agricultural practices to accommodate the changing landscape." When I requested access gates at traditional crossing points, the board unanimously voted against any breaches in the security perimeter. When I proposed water access corridors for the livestock, they cited liability concerns and potential contamination issues. Each reasonable accommodation met the same wall of bureaucratic refusal. In desperation, I consulted Alan Roberts, a local attorney who had handled my property taxes for years. His office, cluttered with farming publications and legal texts, had always felt comforting. Today, his expression offered no such comfort. "I have reviewed everything," Alan said, removing his reading glasses. "Unfortunately, they appear to be operating within technical legal boundaries. That 1978 easement is problematic for us. It contains language about future development accommodation that gives them significant leverage." He shuffled through papers, searching for any silver lining. "We could challenge the interpretation of safety infrastructure as it applies to your grazing access, but similar cases have consistently favored development interests over agricultural needs. A lawsuit would likely cost upwards of $50,000, with maybe a 30% chance of partial victory." The final blow came through Sarah Jenkins, one of the few sympathetic Meadowbrook residents who had befriended me during community events. She arrived at my door one evening, nervously glancing over her shoulder before speaking. "They did not want me to show you this," she whispered, handing me rolled architectural plans. "The fence is just phase 1. They are planning to request rezoning of the buffer zone to build a private recreation area. The long-term development plan shows a community center expansion that would effectively cut off all access to your lower 40 acres. The documents confirmed my worst fears. Detailed renderings showed tennis courts and a swimming pool complex built on what had been designated as the agricultural buffer zone. A proposed water feature would redirect the very stream my cattle depended upon. Most disturbing was the implementation timeline. Construction was scheduled to begin in just 4 months. That night, surrounded by legal papers, financial projections, and property maps, I reached my lowest point. 4 generations of careful stewardship threatened by strangers who viewed my livelihood as an inconvenience to their property values. My grandfather's weathered face stared back at me from a framed photograph on the wall, his expression seeming to ask whether I would be the one to lose what generations had built. Rain pattered against the windows as I contemplated impossible choices. Sell the ranch, fight a losing legal battle, submit to slow strangulation by regulation and boundary disputes. The ranch that had survived drought, economic depression, and family tragedy might not survive this assault of suburban bureaucracy and power plays. With my head in my hands, I surrendered to the hopelessness of my situation, unaware that salvation lay buried in the county's dusty archives. 3 days of despair gave way to restless determination. If I was going to lose everything, I would at least understand exactly how and why. Armed with a thermos of coffee and a legal pad, I arrived at the county records department when it opened at 8 o'clock Monday morning. The aging government building smelled of dust and old paper, a place where the past was preserved in meticulous detail for those patient enough to search. "I need to see all property records, surveys, and easement documents related to Wildflower Ranch and surrounding properties," I told the clerk, an older woman named Doris who had worked there for decades. "Everything dating back to original land grants if possible." Doris raised an eyebrow. "That is a lot of material. Any particular reason?" "Boundary dispute with Meadowbrook Estates," I replied. "I need to understand exactly what rights they have and how they obtained them." She nodded sympathetically. "You are not the first farmer to sit in that chair across from developers. Give me an hour to pull the relevant files." What began as a single-day investigation stretched into a full week of painstaking research. I pored over property maps from every decade, traced ownership transfers, and studied the evolution of county zoning ordinances. Most documents confirmed what I already knew. The 1978 easement provided legal foundation for the HOA actions. But on the fourth day, buried in a misfiled folder of survey amendments, I discovered something extraordinary. A 1994 boundary adjustment, officially recorded but somehow overlooked in recent transactions, showed that the surveyor had corrected an error in the original property line. The correction moved the true boundary 15 feet east, directly contradicting the line the HOA had used for their fence placement. More importantly, the adjusted boundary had been formally registered with the county and signed by all adjacent property owners at that time. My heart raced as I realized the implications. If this document was valid, at least half of the HOA fence stood on land that legally belonged to me, not within their easement zone. I carefully photographed the document, hands trembling with excitement. The second breakthrough came 2 days later in the form of a water rights easement dating back to 1967. The document guaranteed perpetual livestock access to the stream that cut across both properties, specifically prohibiting any structure or impediment that would prevent cattle from reaching water. This easement predated the development easement the HOA had cited and, crucially, contained no expiration provisions. With these documents in hand, I sought out a different legal perspective. Thomas Brennan specialized in agricultural property disputes and had successfully represented several farmers against corporate developers. His downtown office projected competence and success that Allen's humble practice had lacked. Brennan studied the documents carefully, his expression shifting from professional interest to genuine excitement as he grasped their significance. "These are game changers," he said, spreading the survey maps across his desk. "The boundary adjustment alone invalidates half their fence placement. The water rights easement is even stronger. It explicitly protects your livestock access regardless of future development." He made detailed notes, occasionally nodding to himself. "Most importantly, I want to examine the HOA's procedural compliance. Did they follow legal requirements for notification and public comment before beginning construction?" This question prompted another investigation, this time into the HOA's own governance documents and meeting minutes. Sarah Jenkins proved invaluable, secretly providing internal records that revealed disturbing procedural violations. The board had failed to provide legally required public notices about the fence construction. They had bypassed mandatory environmental impact assessments required for projects affecting natural water sources. Most damning, they had misrepresented certain aspects of the project to county officials to expedite permit approvals. These violations alone could force fence removal and potential damages, Brennan explained during our next meeting. But there is something else we should investigate. HOA board members are prohibited from using their positions for personal financial gain. Victoria Harrington's aggressive pursuit of this project seems unusually personal. Following this thread led to the most shocking discovery yet. Public property records revealed that Victoria Harrington was not merely the HOA president. She was also a silent partner in Meadowbrook Development Group, the company that owned the undeveloped parcels adjacent to my property and stood to profit enormously from the planned recreation complex. Her husband's construction company had received the exclusive contract for the fence installation, paying him nearly double market rates. "This is a clear conflict of interest," Brennan said, reviewing the ownership documents. She never disclosed these financial connections to the HOA members or recused herself from votes involving the development plans. My kitchen table, once covered with evidence of defeat, now displayed a different story. Property surveys with the corrected boundary clearly marked, water rights documents protecting livestock access, HOA procedural violations documented in their own meeting minutes, evidence of Victoria's undisclosed financial interests. Together, they formed not just a defense but a powerful counterattack. That night, as rain drummed against the windows, I no longer felt hopeless. For the first time since finding those survey stakes weeks earlier, I felt something new stirring within me. Not just anger or determination, but the calm certainty that comes with having the truth on your side. The tactical revenge plan took shape under the same lamp that had witnessed my tears of frustration just days before. Their fence had been just the first move in a larger game. Now I understood the board and the rules completely. My response would change everything. The realization that struck me at 3 in the morning was elegant in its simplicity. The main access road into Meadowbrook Estates crossed a narrow strip of what was legally my property according to the corrected boundary survey. For years, I had allowed this access without question, assuming the road existed on the development's land. But the 1994 boundary adjustment placed approximately 30 feet of their only entrance road squarely on my property. Dawn found me walking this critical section, measuring distances with a surveyor's wheel. The two-lane paved road served as the sole entry point for all 96 homes in the development. No secondary access existed. The subdivision's design had prioritized maximizing lot numbers over creating backup entry points. One well-placed barrier here would effectively isolate the entire community. By noon, I had contacted Carson Surveying, an independent firm with no ties to local developers. Their lead surveyor, Jim Carson, agreed to verify the boundary discrepancy. "We need absolute precision," I explained as Jim set up his equipment. "These measurements must be unimpeachable if challenged in court." 2 days later, Jim delivered the survey results, officially notarized and certified. "Your property line definitely extends across approximately 32.4 feet of their access road," he confirmed. The 1994 adjustment was properly filed but somehow overlooked during development planning. This happens more often than people realize. Old corrections get buried in county records. With legal boundaries established, I consulted with Parker Engineering about structural requirements for a security gate system. Their representative, Lisa Chen, visited the site to assess feasibility. "A commercial-grade gate system here would be straightforward," she explained, marking potential anchor points on a satellite image. "The natural topography actually works in your favor. These elevated areas on either side create perfect anchor points for security fencing that would be very difficult to circumvent." Materials began arriving gradually over the following weeks, delivered to the back section of my property, well hidden from Meadowbrook residents. Steel posts, concrete mix, heavy gauge fencing, and an industrial gate system accumulated behind my barn, away from prying eyes. I contracted with Martinez Construction, specifying all work would need to happen rapidly within a single weekend. "We will need at least 8 workers to complete this in the time frame you want," Javier Martinez explained during our planning meeting. "But my team can handle it. We do commercial security installations all the time." Strategic alliances within Meadowbrook proved crucial to my plan. Sarah Jenkins had introduced me to other sympathetic homeowners frustrated with rising HOA fees and arbitrary rule enforcement. These insider contacts provided valuable intelligence. The HOA board had scheduled their annual planning retreat for the second weekend in October, a 2-day event held at a resort 2 hours away. "All 5 board members always attend," confirmed Michael Parker, another disgruntled resident. "They use it for long-term planning and budget discussions. Victoria has mentioned several times that they will be finalizing plans for the recreation complex during this retreat." Document preparation became my evening project. Working with attorney Brennan, I drafted formal notices asserting property rights, easement enforcement documentation, and trespass warnings. Each document cited specific legal statutes and included copies of the certified surveys and historical easements. These need to be prominently displayed, Brennan advised. Anyone challenging your right to inst. All this gate needs to immediately see the legal justification. Financial preparation required liquidating some assets. I sold 20 head of cattle and equipment I could temporarily function without, creating a legal defense fund sufficient to weather the coming storm. The sacrifice was painful but necessary. Half measures would not succeed against an opponent like Victoria Harrington. Evidence collection intensified as the date approached. I meticulously photographed every inch of the HOA fence that encroached on my property according to the corrected survey. I recorded conversations with county officials acknowledging procedural irregularities in the permit process. Most valuable were recordings provided by Sarah of HOA meetings, where Victoria had explicitly denied any personal financial interest in the development plans. Throughout these preparations, I maintained my regular routine, tending livestock, repairing fences, and occasionally chatting with Meadowbrook residents who stopped to talk while walking. Maintaining normalcy was crucial. Any hint of my intentions would likely reach Victoria and spoil the element of surprise. 3 days before the planned installation, I called my most trusted neighbors, fellow ranchers who understood property rights disputes with developers. Without revealing specifics, I asked if they would be available as witnesses and moral support during the weekend. All agreed immediately, recognizing the significance of the request. The night before the HOA retreat, I sent a carefully worded text message to Sarah and my other allies within Meadowbrook. You might want to consider having extra supplies this weekend. Road maintenance might cause temporary access issues. Subtle enough to provide deniable warning while avoiding any appearance of creating undue hardship for residents. Falling asleep that final night proved nearly impossible. The chess pieces were in position while the HOA remained oblivious to the coming move. The methodical preparation of the past week stood in stark contrast to the emotional devastation I had felt initially. Tomorrow would transform this property dispute permanently. As ranch operations had taught me through countless seasons, proper preparation prevents poor performance. The HOA was about to learn this lesson at considerable cost. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather for construction, clear skies and moderate temperatures. By 5:30, I stood at the critical section of access road with Javier Martinez and his 8-man crew. The HOA board had departed for their retreat the previous evening, with Victoria Harrington posting photos of their luxury resort arrival on the community's social page. Their absence created the perfect window of opportunity. We have approximately 36 hours before they return, I told the crew. Everything needs to be not just installed but properly cured and fully functional by then. Javier nodded confidently. We brought quickset industrial concrete. The main gate structure will be set and functional within 12 hours. The connecting fencing will progress simultaneously from both directions. The operation began with military precision. The road was temporarily blocked with construction barriers, while survey markers established exact property boundaries. Heavy equipment dug foundation trenches for the main gate posts, massive steel columns capable of supporting an industrial-grade security gate. Concrete mixers poured foundations, while another team began installing fence posts extending from the gate location toward natural barriers on both sides. By mid-morning, curious Meadowbrook residents began appearing, watching the construction with growing concern. A middle-aged man in golf attire approached first. "Excuse me, what is happening here? This is the only way in and out of our neighborhood," he said, brow furrowed with confusion. I handed him one of the prepared information packets. "This is the correction of a property boundary error. This section of road crosses land that legally belongs to Wildflower Ranch. Please see the attached certified surveys and county documentation." More residents gathered as the morning progressed, reactions ranging from confusion to outrage. I remained calm, distributing information packets and directing specific complaints to the laminated notice boards installed along the perimeter. By noon, the community chat groups were exploding with activity, residents sharing information and speculating about the construction's purpose. The main gate posts stood like sentinels by early afternoon, concrete setting around their bases, while workers assembled the heavy steel gate panels nearby. Connecting fence sections extended rapidly in both directions, creating an imposing barrier that would prevent any circumvention of the main gate. By 4 o'clock, the concrete had set sufficiently to hang the massive gate panels, 12 feet high with advanced locking mechanisms, accessible only with a specialized key. Sarah Jenkins approached as workers installed the lock system. "This is beyond anything I expected," she said quietly. "Half the neighborhood is in panic mode. People are calling the HOA board but getting no answers." Victoria turned her phone off during the retreat. "How are the supplies holding up for people?" I asked, genuinely concerned about hardship for innocent residents. "Most families are fine. Your warning gave them time to prepare. Some are actually enjoying the drama, treating it like a community event. Others are furious." As evening approached, the installation neared completion. Laminated legal notices lined the fence at regular intervals, clearly stating property boundaries, citing relevant laws, and explaining the legal basis for the access restriction. Security lights activated automatically at dusk, illuminating the imposing barrier that now controlled all access to Meadowbrook Estates. The first real confrontation came at 7:30 when 3 police cruisers arrived, responding to multiple resident complaints. Sheriff Thompson, whom I had known for years, approached with professional caution. "We have received numerous calls about a blockade situation," he said, surveying the gate and fence. "Want to explain what is happening here, Jim?" I provided him complete documentation. The certified surveys, easement records, property deeds, and legal opinions supporting my right to control access across my property. "This is not a blockade, Sheriff. This is a property owner exercising legal control over his land, which happens to include this section of road according to official county records. The HOA installed a similar fence across my property last month without warning or compensation." The sheriff spent nearly an hour reviewing documents and consulting by phone with the county attorney. Meanwhile, a crowd of residents gathered on the development side of the gate, their mood growing increasingly tense. Finally, Sheriff Thompson addressed the crowd. "After reviewing the documentation and consulting with legal counsel, we have determined this is a civil matter, not a criminal one. The property boundary claim appears to have legal merit based on county records. We cannot order removal of this structure without court intervention." A collective groan rose from the residents, followed by heated arguments and demands for action. The sheriff raised his hands for quiet. "I understand your frustration, but property disputes must be handled through proper legal channels. Emergency vehicles will still have access through arrangements already made with fire and medical services. I suggest contacting your HOA representatives regarding next steps." Sunday morning brought the inevitable escalation. Victoria Harrington's black Cadillac Escalade screeched to a halt before the gate at 10:15, returning a day early from the retreat after countless panicked calls from residents. Her face contorted with rage as she stormed toward where I stood calmly waiting. "What have you done?" she demanded, voice trembling with fury. "This is illegal. You have imprisoned an entire community." "Nothing illegal has occurred here, Ms. Harrington," I replied evenly, opening a thick folder of documentation. "This gate stands on land legally belonging to Wildflower Ranch, as confirmed by county records and this certified survey. Perhaps your development team should have researched property boundaries more carefully before building an access road across my land." Victoria snatched the documents, flipping through them with increasing agitation. Other board members had arrived now, gathering behind her with expressions ranging from shock to calculation. "This is outrageous," she sputtered. "You cannot just lock out an entire neighborhood. There are children, elderly people." "Interesting perspective," I interrupted. "That is precisely what your HOA did to my livestock when you fenced off their water access. The difference is, I have legal standing for my actions. Do you?" Sheriff Thompson returned mid-morning, accompanied by the county attorney. Once again, legal documents were examined, property lines verified, and precedents discussed. The growing crowd of residents listened intently as the officials reluctantly confirmed that, without an emergency court order, they had no authority to remove a structure built on private property. "The property owner has provided emergency access codes to fire and medical services," the county attorney explained to the residents. "While inconvenient, this situation does not constitute an illegal imprisonment or safety hazard under county ordinances." Victoria's face had transformed from rage to calculation. She pulled her fellow board members into a huddle, their urgent whispers carrying undertones of panic. The power dynamic had visibly shifted as realization dawned that their board had potentially made a devastating legal miscalculation. As residents began directing their questions and anger toward their own leadership rather than me, I stood quietly by my gate, holding the only key to the neighborhood's freedom. Monday evening found the Meadowbrook Estates Community Center filled beyond capacity. Residents packed every available seat while dozens more stood along walls, their faces reflecting emotions ranging from anger to curiosity. The emergency HOA meeting had been hastily organized after a full day of legal consultations had made the board's position clear. They had built their fence on my property, and I had responded in kind. Victoria Harrington sat center stage behind a long table, flanked by nervous board members. Her usual composure had cracked, makeup failing to conceal her distress. I observed quietly from the back row, Attorney Brennan beside me taking careful notes. "The board is actively pursuing all legal remedies to this situation," Victoria announced, her voice lacking its usual confidence. "We expect access to be restored within." "Why did you build on his land first?" interrupted an elderly gentleman from the front row. "We just found out your fence is actually on his property too." The question sparked dozens more. Why had the board not performed proper surveys? Why were environmental impact studies bypassed? How had construction permits been obtained without proper notifications? With each question, the board's responses grew more evasive, residents more frustrated. The meeting's turning point came when Michael Parker stood up, holding printouts of property records. "These documents show that Victoria Harrington is a silent partner in Meadowbrook Development Group, which owns the land where they plan to build the recreation center. Her husband's company received the fence construction contract at twice market rate. Neither relationship was disclosed to homeowners during project approval." Stunned silence fell over the room before erupting into outraged voices. Victoria attempted to restore order, but residents continued demanding answers about apparent conflicts of interest and financial improprieties. The carefully constructed HOA facade crumbled under resident scrutiny. The following morning, negotiations began in earnest. Attorney Brennan represented my interests in a conference room at the county courthouse, facing 3 lawyers hastily retained by the HOA. The power dynamic clearly favored our meticulously documented position. By afternoon, settlement terms emerged: immediate removal of the HOA fence encroaching on my property, substantial financial compensation for damages, lost productivity and legal expenses, formal easements guaranteeing livestock water access in perpetuity, and binding restrictions preventing future development along shared boundaries without mutual consent. Most satisfying was the requirement that Victoria Harrington resign from the board and divest any financial interests related to Meadowbrook development. Her conflict of interest became public record through mandatory disclosures in the settlement agreement. Within days, work crews dismantled the HOA fence that had divided my ranch. True to my word, once their fence came down, I removed my gate from their access road, though I retained legal ownership of that land through a formal access easement that prevented future disputes. Community transformation followed as residents implemented governance reforms. The new HOA board, led by Sarah Jenkins, established transparency requirements and limits on board authority. Mandatory disclosures prevented future conflicts of interest, while bylaws amendments required home,